right. Here we go. So today we're going to just talk a little bit about immigration. And yours may look a little different, but it's the same stuff. Okay, so just as a reminder, the first group of immigrants came from what part of Europe? Who came first? Yep, this side, right? Before 1880, it was mostly North and Western immigrants of Europe. So you're going to see Irish, English, Scottish, people like that typically. Even like Dutch, Belgium, that kind of thing. And one of the things, like I said, you'll see there's a timeline up around the room. We're going to be putting some little slips. You see this little poster here that represent your ancestors and when they came over. So we'll kind of see how that works. The second group came from Southeastern Europe. These tended to be Polish, Czechoslovakian, Hungarian, Slovenian. Okay. So they tended to come a little bit later after 1880. What did they come for? I showed you this, now let's write it down. West Indies, Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, they basically came for jobs because there just weren't enough around. Chinese, they came for two reasons. Yeah, and they still are looking for those today, yeah. The Chinese came because of the gold rush and because of the railroad. They worked on the railroad. A lot of them went over to California for the gold rush and then just stayed and worked on the railroad as they crossed the nation. If you were from Russia, like some of my family, we had a lot of Jewish persecution. So they left there because of what was happening to that group. I am Prussian, which is German Russian.
Why is it
Because in that day, there was another country that was there, and it was basically right by the border of Germany and Russia together. It was called Prussia. So, that's all right. In Europe, we know there was a huge population boom. The population doubled. So the cities were just packed, like jam-packed. A lot of them were looking for independence or just like being able to be treated like a normal person. Like we said about Ireland, for example, or Scotland. If you were third class, you had no chance of being first class. And of course, they heard about this free land that we offered. So cool. The Japanese, kind of interesting. They typically went into Hawaii quite a bit when they first immigrated. And that's why you will see a lot of Japanese people when you visit Hawaii. They worked there on the sugarcane plantations for quote unquote high wages. And the Irish had a special situation, as we said. They had the potato famine of 1845. So you will see as we put our little names up on our timeline, we'll have a lot of green Irish right over there on that wall. That's where they'll be mostly. Or they'll start there anyway. And one of the things we talked about for those of us going to Ireland and Scotland the other night was the reason why they were starving is because the Irish people were forced to eat the potatoes, but all the vegetables, the meat, and all that stuff, the British were shipping all of that out to England. And they weren't allowed to eat all that stuff. So that's why they were starving so much. That was the staple of their diet. All right, now I have to tell you, even today, I have a good friend who lives across from me, and she married a guy who is Muslim, and he's Middle Eastern, and he is taking some really bad stuff right now because of what happened in Paris. You would not believe the awful things people have said to him. I just feel so bad. But all of us have been the picked on guy in this country. And it's so sad. I think we always pick on the new guy. I swear. So let me show you some examples where we have all been picked on. A lot of them had very derogatory names, especially during this time period, around that 1900 era. And most of them came about during that immigration time because they're the new people. And you'll need these to kind of understand some of your readings. So, for example, the Italians were called wops. Have you ever heard that before? And it actually is interesting where it comes from. Many Italians came to America without their papers, and so on their document would be stamped WOP, standing for without papers. So people started calling Italians wops for that reason. And it became a very negative, derogatory name. The Chinese, as you saw in our movie, do you remember when they were working on the railroad? They called them coolies. Where does that come from? It comes from the Turkish word, the Urdu word, kuli, which means day laborer. And the Chinese were labor workers, like they did on the railroad. And since so many Chinese worked on the railroad, the name stuck and they called them coolies for being a day laborer. Germans, I'm 3/4 German. We also had our own nickname. Squareheads, you are right. We were called squareheads, especially up here in this part of America, because the German Scandinavian immigrants seem to have a square-looking head.
Ha.
I know, Toby's like, do I look square? Yeah, we tended to have a really strong jawline, which makes our face look very square. Yeah. Okay. Then our Irish people, they got called mix. You ever heard of that name before, mix? Very derogatory name, and you probably get punched if you called somebody that today. Back then as well. But this is where it comes from. I thought it was so interesting. There's two theories. First of all, it seemed like every Irish immigrant had an MC at the beginning of their name, like McDonald, McNeil, right? McDaniel. Their names start with MC. So some people think it came from that. There's also another theory. Irishmen got the reputation to be drinkers, and Mick sounds like a drunken hiccup. Like, I can't do it. But so that maybe it comes from that drinking tradition as well. Hispanics also have a nickname even today, but it's interesting to see where it comes from. They have the nickname of a spick, which is a very negative word, right? Those are fighting words, right? But where it comes from is really interesting. Okay, the nickname actually came from the term Mick up here, because since both Irish and Hispanics were Catholic, they lived in the same area, so they were known as a Spanish Mick, because they lived with the Micks. Well, then they took SP from the Spanish heritage and made it into a spick. So it actually came from the Irish nickname. So we have all been picked on at some point. Good grief. Oh yeah. Well, I've heard slogans like, if you're Dutch, you ain't much. Things like that. All kinds of stuff. So.
What's English?
English were the first here, but you know what? Even during the Revolutionary War, the English people that were loyalists, that were loyal to England, were picked on because they didn't like what they believed in. So we've all been picked on, haven't we? All right, now if you take a look at our Statue of Liberty, on here it says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So in common language, what does this mean? Take a look at it. I'll give you a minute to look at it. Okay, everybody matters. And what are we encouraging them to do, Riley? We're welcoming everybody. And what kind of people are we welcoming? The poor. Everybody. Whether they are tired and poor, whether they're yearning to breathe free, maybe they have been oppressed by a leader. We basically are saying, welcome. We want you here, right? Do you think we follow this guideline today? No. All right. Hold on. Let me get your ideas. Luke, you say no. How come?
A lot of political debate today is about Hispanics and border crossing, as well as Muslim refugees from the Syrian and Iraq area.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't want to let any of them in.
Yeah. In fact, you've been watching the news. There are a group of governors that are trying to stand up against the president and say, you can't make us take in Syrian refugees into our state because they're afraid that they might be terrorists, you know? All right with that? Yes, actually, most. I think there's one that might be Democrat, but most of them are Republican. Now, based on our documentation, we don't think that they have a ground to stand on, but it's a big deal because there's been very few times that our state governors have stood up against the president. So if nothing else, this is interesting for history's sake. Whether it's right or wrong is a whole nother opinion, right? Okay, so that's a big issue right now. Bryn, what do you think?
Donald Trump, like, totally,
saying bad things about people. And okay. 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 This issue in Paris obviously has had us kind of really tight on our borders. Okay. Very true. Right, Ryan?
Evacuating the refugees and stuff, because we're supposedly going to begin bombing runs on ISIS, and we don't want collateral damage. And then you
Yeah.
back and go, didn't we drop an atomic bomb twice on Japan without it?
Well, we had collateral damage, but you didn't care about it, did we? Yeah. Anybody that thinks the opposite, that thinks we do still stand for this?
Yeah, I protect us.
Okay, and we understand wanting to protect us, right? We get it. Yeah, we get it. You know, I look at, okay, so you have to look at their background in the history to understand whether we can trust them in our country, right? Yeah. And yet, you know what? I see some great stories. I'll tell you what I just heard today. We have a family that I know, and they have 2 daughters. The dad, by the way, ran an entire oil well company, an entire company in his home country. Listen, please. Ran an entire company. Mom was a nurse back in her home country. They came here so that their 2 daughters could get a college education, and they're working at John Morales. Working manual labor because they want something better for their kids. That is amazing to me. First of all, that they would be willing to sacrifice their own careers and their future so that their kids can have a better future. And we have that family here living today. So we did a good thing there, right? We're just being a little cautious about which ones, right? Yeah. Something to think about. I think every once in a while, as Americans, we need to read this. And we need to remember what we stand for. Because guess what? If we didn't have this, you wouldn't be sitting here. My family wouldn't have been able to be here, right? Because they could have said no more Germans or no more Irish or no more Japanese. And we've done it. Unfortunately, that's one of the things we're going to show you. We've had some of the most racist acts in history in the United States. Let's take a look. Now, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about our immigration around 1900. Because you are going to actually write something with this, all right? So listen carefully. Although 10 million Americans in 1900 worked on farms, so 10 million worked on farms, that number was exceeded by the total number in non-agricultural employment. Over 6 million Americans labored in manufacturing, almost 4 million in the service sector, like business clerks, secretaries, sales agents, etc. Over 3 million in transportation and construction. I gotta switch colors again. 2 million in trade, finance, or real estate. And 300,000 in local, state, or federal government. Now, from 1890 to 1900, the number of farm jobs increased by 7%. So agricultural jobs, 7%. While the number of manufacturing jobs left by 1/3. By 1900, manufacturing had become a major force in the national economy. Are you ready for your mission? Your mission, if I can get it to move, I gotta move this over here. There we go. Oh, can't get to it. There we go. This paragraph would make a lot more sense if we use something picturesque to explain it. So I'm going to put you in a small group, and you are going to create a graph of your choice to represent these statistics and show us those numbers. Whatever graph you want, whether it's a pie graph, line graph, bar graph, you are going to represent those things. Are you ready? Okay, so here we go. You 3, work together. You 3, you 4, you 4, you 4, you 4. You 3, and you 3. Go to it. You need to represent this with a picturesque kind of a graph of some sort. No, but you might want to know your total. Let me turn off my mic.
Sir, you're not with.
Okay, so now that you've had a chance to work in your small groups, you can definitely see that maybe a visual representation of this paragraph would work a lot better than this paragraph with all the words in it. It makes a lot more sense that way, doesn't it? All right. One of the things I want you to see by looking at your graphs is notice that we are increasing in number in the United States in every area. So yes, more people are going to the cities than in the farms, but the farms are also increasing at the very same time. So that's why when we talked about the populace being unhappy because of competition, there were so many people coming that it increased everywhere. So we'll be getting into the cities later on. Okay, so I told you that unfortunately there are some events in our history that I'm not real proud of. We had some legal restrictions on immigration in our history. Let's take a look at some of those. In 1882, we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act that basically just said we didn't want any more Chinese in the United States. The basis behind it, honestly, was that we were worried that we wouldn't look white enough. And if we had too many Asians in our country, it might change the look of Americans. We wanted to still be looking more Euro background. 1891, we passed an act that said we would not allow any epileptics, beggars, or anarchists in our country. Now, first of all, let's talk about those things. You probably know someone who has epilepsy, right? And they have seizures. Can they control that? No. You know, it's not like you can completely solve that issue. It's there. And is it their fault? No. Is it going to harm anybody? No, not as long as you aren't, you know, in the way when they're tensing up or things like that. If they're more dangerous to themselves than anybody else. Yet we didn't want those kind of people here. We didn't want beggars here. Well, how do you tell who's a beggar when they come across in Ellis Island? You know, do you look at their clothing? You ask what jobs they've had. And again, remember, in our statement it said, we welcome you tired, you poor, you hungry, you yearning to breathe free, right? The third thing are anarchists. Now, what is an anarchist? Yes, an anarchist is somebody who is basically uprooting the government, right? Can you tell who is an anarchist by looking at them? Like Ryan, yep, sure enough, he's an anarchist. I can just tell by his smile. That is a belief system, right? That is something to do with the way you see a government should be run. So a lot of times we would judge an anarchist by the country that they were from. And if we didn't agree with their system and their government in that country, then we would assume they were an anarchist. Let's take a look at another one. In 1907, we passed an act that said no imbeciles, no convicts, and nobody with tuberculosis. Now, I actually understand the one with TB. You know, if we've got a contagious disease, remember just, gosh, not even a year ago, we had this whole big thing about this disease that was spreading, and we were so worried about it. I get being worried about that and keeping that outside your borders. Convicts, I could even see that. Do we want criminals filling our country? No, although I think it's really funny that, you know, the basis of our country, we had a lot of convicts in the 13 colonies because they were given an option. Either you stay here or you go to the New World, you know. Either you go to jail in England or you go to the New World. So they chose that. In fact, South Dakota was full of convicts because, again, they were allowed to either sit in jail on the East Coast or they said you could go out west and try living out there. So I think that's interesting, but I get it. The other thing they mentioned was an imbecile. And we talked about this yesterday in our simulation, right? What they mean by an imbecile is somebody who is mentally handicapped. Someone who maybe doesn't read very well or has a learning disability. And we unfortunately said we didn't want any of that in our country. This one is probably the worst of them all, if you ask me. Let me try to pull it down just to here. Good grief. The 1924 Johnson-Reed Act set a limit of 150,000 immigrants a year. Now, we have a limit every year, even now. So that's not abnormal. But here's the abnormal part. They basically said that the percentage of the people that are in our society has to match the makeup of the percentage of people that you're bringing into our society. We wanted to keep it looking the same way. So for example, using the graph below, if you had 100 immigrants, how many would you allow from each nationality? So you'll notice the green represents Caucasian, and in our country, in the US, we are about 79.9% Caucasian. So out of 100 immigrants, how many had to be Caucasian? 79 or 80, right? The purple area is African American, and we are about 12.8%. So that meant only 12 of our immigrants could be African in descent. The blue area is Asian, and we are usually about 4.4% Asian. So again, they would only allow 4 Asians out of 100 in. And the last group is other, from other countries all over, 2.76%. And so only 2 or maybe 3 immigrants would be allowed in from those other areas. And ultimately, like I said, it was because we wanted to make sure that we looked the same as we have from the start. Really interesting, right? Okay. So the question is, why don't we allow all immigrants to come to the United States? What do you think? Don't we just say, everybody that wants to come, just come? Well, obviously, yeah, we would be completely crowded. Our country would be full, right? Because there's a lot of people that want to come here for whatever reason. Maybe they're escaping a bad leader, or they don't have food, or they don't have jobs. So they want this place where there's opportunity for those things. This also means that there would be more competition for the jobs that you want, right? And that makes it tough for you. We also just talked today about how we're being careful about what kind of refugees are being allowed in our country because of the terrorist attack in Paris this year. So we're worried about those kind of things too. So let's take a look at the current immigration laws. This is based on the Immigration Act of 1990, in case you're wondering what it is today. This limits immigrants from any single country to no more than 7% of the annual visas. So typically, let's say we're talking about Syria. Syrians could only represent 7% of the visas that we give out this year. Secondly, we allow 675,000 immigrants in the United States each year, at this point anyway, which is actually quite a bit when you think about it, right? Think about increasing every year by almost 700,000 people. Third, understand that this does not include refugees or people fleeing persecution. So like I said, when I use that example of Syria, that's actually kind of a bad example because they would be considered refugees that are fleeing persecution. And in that case, you can give an exemption to allow more people from that particular culture. Now, I will tell you that I had, my brother actually had a friend, he was about 3 years younger than me in high school, and he came over from Cambodia in the 1980s. And if you kind of have learned anything about the Vietnam War already, you'll know that because of the Vietnam War and some bombing that we did, Cambodia was a real mess after the Vietnam War. There was a guy in charge named Pol Pot who was doing horrible things to people. If you were educated, you were dead because he didn't want anybody that was a threat to his society. And so let me tell you the story of Tan is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. His family was put in a prison camp because his father was a teacher, and teachers, of course, are dangerous. He had hidden the fact that he was a teacher up to that point, but he knew that their days were numbered. Okay, and they had young sons. Well, first of all, they were living in grass huts in these camps. They had not enough food to eat, and people were dying of starvation by the thousands. The only way that Tan survived is he ate snakes. He would grab little snakes and lizards, and he would eat them because they knew they needed the protein. So that in itself is an amazing story, right? Well, his family had decided that they needed to get their kids out of there. So they basically planned for their two sons to escape one night. And the soldiers were after them, trying to find them. And these two boys, would you believe, they basically hid underneath a pile of dead bodies in a ditch as they walked by until it was clear. Then they basically went through a jungle for over a week to get out of Cambodia and get into a nearby country so that they could get out of there. They actually went against tigers and all kinds of crazy stuff. Not only are you worried about food and safety, but you're also worried about even wild animals. That's hard for us to even fathom. They finally got in there, and they had enough money to get he and his brother in. Well, and they were also an exemption to the rule, so they were allowed in. Well, Tan was my brother's age, right? So he was a freshman when I was a senior. And here's what Tan did. Tan was going to get the highest paying job he could in the United States. He was going to be a doctor. And the reason he wanted to do that was because he wanted to save up enough money so that his parents could come to America and he would save them from the government in Cambodia. And would you believe this? He took every single class in high school twice. The first time, he just took it pass fail because he was learning the language, and he wanted to make sure that he got all A's and he aced all of his classes so that he could become a doctor. Can you imagine taking this class twice just because you want to ace it? That's just amazing to me. And would you believe he did it? He's an amazing guy. Unfortunately, by the time he was through high school, his parents had been killed because they'd been discovered by the government. But that's just an example of some of the people that come to our country, and we don't even really think about the things they faced. They're so grateful to be here where they have freedom. They also encourage immigrants to come to the U.S. with extraordinary abilities, like scientists who cure cancer, people in the space race, things like that, people that have those special skills. So we do give out 140,000 visas to people in this area with a guaranteed job, that they're going to do some specific job for us in the US. An example of that, after World War II, we actually allowed a lot of the Nazi scientists to come over to the US. Here we hated them and were at war against them a few years before. But then we're in the middle of the Cold War and we needed their help. So we basically gave them some visas so they could help us out. And then there are also special immigrants, we call it, that are allowed in. Refugees displaced by war. For example, at the end of Vietnam, remember that we were helping the South Vietnamese fight the North Vietnamese. Well, as the North Vietnamese finally invaded South Vietnam, all of those generals and political leaders that we had been working with, that were helping us, they're sitting there and they know they're going to die. So we sent in helicopters to pull out those leaders, as many as we could anyway, and their families, and those were allowed in the U.S. because they were a special case. Others might be close relatives to U.S. citizens, or those admitted through private laws passed by Congress. One example of that, this happened probably before your time, but it was big news at the time. There was a family called the Gonzalez family, and he and his mother, I believe, had come across from Mexico, came all the way across the water in the Gulf on an inner tube. Well, as they went across, his mother died. He ended up on the shores of the U.S., And there were a lot of questions about, well, should we send him back to Mexico? Should we keep him here? And in the end, what happened was there were relatives here from the Gonzalez family, and they had taken Elian in, and they came in, the government came in with SWAT team, basically. You see the picture there, and they took this kid out of their house. It made our country look really, really bad because they were going to send him away. But in that case, Congress can make a special exemption and say, no, we're going to allow Elian to stay. So that is another exemption. All right, so let's talk about some different things now. We talked about immigration, and these immigrants are coming to these big cities in the U.S. around 1900, and they had what we called political bosses that ran those slums of the city. One of the most famous is a guy named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed was a New York politician, and he ran what we call Tammany Hall, which was the New York City Democratic headquarters. He ran that whole thing and had control over basically everybody in it. Long story, but he was basically making money off of you, and this is how it would work. So Toby, you want to come to the United States, huh? Just got here off the boat. Well, a guy would run in and meet him and say, hey, I'm Irish too. I know what it's like to be Irish in this country. I tell you what, I will give you a job. I'll also give you a place to stay and even a little bit of spending money to get you on your feet since we're fellow Irishmen. Give me a bump, you know. Oh man, Toby's thinking this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, man. Like, America's wonderful. They take care of us. So, you know, sure enough, he goes with his wife and they get settled in this apartment. It might not be anything fancy, but they have a roof over their head. They got a job at the turkey plucking factory, and at least things are going okay because they're free here. Well, they think they're free. Then that friend of theirs comes and knocks on the door and says, hey, by the way, just a reminder, all you have to do for you to get what you're doing right now is you have to vote for this guy named Boss Tweed in the next election, okay? And everybody that he likes, you'll vote for them. And things will be good. Sounds great. Okay, whatever. Do I care? Nope. No, not really. So I vote for them. Although I should have freedom, shouldn't I? And then they come knocking on the door about once a week. And they said, you know what? You need to be thankful to Boss Tweed for what he's given you as a loan. So now you need to pay a percentage of your income every week. And you start taking that money from them. And if you didn't, here's what would happen. Old Boss Tweed would kick you out of your apartment, would tell everybody in New York to not allow you in, so you had nowhere to go and nowhere to live. They would take your jobs from you and you would be starving to death and no one would help you. It's just the way it was. They had that much control. Well, eventually, the city kind of finds out what's going on. They sue him. He ends up fleeing the country. And then, believe it or not, a picture in a newspaper makes people realize who he was. And they captured him, and then he eventually did die in prison. Crazy guy. We'll learn more about him, but basically he made $30 to $200 million while he was in charge of Tammany Hall. No one knows for sure how much because, of course, it was not on the books. So the question is, how did he make his money? Obviously, he had these little taxes that he taxed all of his people that he had that were loyal to him, but it was more than that. He would also take and he would charge extra for city contracts. So let's say that we need a new city hall built in town. Well, he would tell the people that it cost $100,000 to build that building and to pay for all the workers and to put the toilets in and all that fun stuff and the doors. Well, if you really figured it out and you looked at the bills, somehow that door that should cost you maybe $5 in the day was costing them $15. So he was overcharging the people, the city, for those things. And that's how he's getting a kickback for all those jobs. Oops. This is the guy who took down Boss Tweed. Now, Thomas Nast is rather unique. He was an artist. He was actually a cartoonist for Harper's Weekly. So you artists, you can make a difference. This guy did an incredible thing. He was a cartoonist, and by the way, he could not read or write, but he loved to draw. He was a great artist. So here's what happened. He saw what was going on with Boss Tweed, and he started making cartoons showing the things that Boss Tweed was doing in the city. And he used the Tammany tiger to represent Boss Tweed's Tammany Hall. I think I have one over here. So let's show you this. Here's just one example. Now you'll notice Tammany Hall is represented with the tiger. And does anybody know who this person is that's represented down under the tiger? This is Lady Justice. Now in political cartoons, Lady Justice is dressed a lot like the Statue of Liberty. She has the gown on and stuff, although she holds a sword up in her hand as a sign of justice. And usually she'll have one of those scales in her other hand. And you can see that he's destroying justice. And then up above, notice where are we located in this picture? Yeah, they're in a Roman Colosseum. So they're watching as they're destroying this Lady Justice. And look at who's sitting in the king's chair. Right up here, yep, it's Boss Tweed and his ring of people that were helping him out. And they're just watching as this stuff goes on. So this is one of Nast's cartoons. He was letting people know. Oh my goodness, this is crazy. Oh, stop. Sorry, technical difficulty. But he was just letting the people in town know what Boss Tweed was really up to. He also is the guy that created the donkey as a symbol for Democrats, the elephant to represent Republicans, and he is the reason that we see Santa Claus the way we do today, because he drew Santa Claus like that. So the question is, why did cartoons work to take Tweed down? Well, remember that most of you immigrants that came to America, you came from all these different countries, right? And most of you spoke different languages and didn't speak English, or not very much. But the thing was, all people could see pictures and could understand pictures. So at this point, pictures were more powerful in New York than any article that you could ever write in the paper, because this appealed to everybody, and everybody knew what was going on with Boss Tweed. Pretty cool story. All right, now I want us to take a look here. This is a map showing European immigration, as in leaving Europe to the US from 1820 to 1920. And I want us to highlight the countries that gave us the most immigrants. Can you see what our highest numbers are here? Okay, let me even that out a little bit. Good. We've got a lot from Austria-Hungary, 3.7 million. That's a huge group, isn't it? We've got 2 million Jews from over here in that old Prussia area. We've got 5.5 million from Germany. Other million areas. Italy, 4 million from Italy. Good. 4.4 million from Ireland. 2.5 million from England. 1 million from Sweden. And then if you look, the others are still a lot, but just not as much. So for example, we've got 530,000 from France. We've got 730,000 from Norway, 570,000 from Scotland, 300,000 from Denmark, 200,000 from the Netherlands, 350,000 from Greece, 220,000 from Turkey over here. And then you've also got your smaller numbers like Portugal and Spain and Belgium. Pretty crazy, right? All right, now let's look at our next map and see where they settle. All right, I really find this interesting because I think it tells us a lot about why people believe the things they do in our country. This is a map showing where the foreign-born lived in 1900. Now, if you look, like the pink areas, those are 30% foreign-born. So those are really like lots and lots of new immigrants. If you look at like the green, that's 20 to 30%. And if you go to the other spectrum, the very few amount of foreign-born immigrants are in yellow and orange. So first of all, where do you see that big 30% foreign-born group? Where are those at? Yep, they're up north, Midwest, right here in our home area, right? Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin area right up there. We've got a group in Montana. Where else? Yep, down here by Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. Good. We've got a group here in Wyoming, which is rather interesting. Over here in Massachusetts, New Hampshire. We've got a nice little group over here in California and a little bit in Nevada. A little tiny one up here in Oregon. So let me ask you this question. Why do you think those areas have so many foreign-born immigrants? Exactly. What are they right next to? They're next to borders, aren't they? So we're seeing a lot of immigrants coming in from Canada up here, and that's where they're ending up. They're just staying there. So we have lots of immigrants in North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana area, stuff like that. Also down here from Texas, here in Arizona, they're coming up from the Mexico direction. That explains those. How about this California spot right here? Good, you remembered. Remember that we had a little border area here called Angel Island? And that's where all of our immigrants went through from the West Coast. And so a lot of them are just staying right there. Same thing along the East Coast here. You'll see there's a little spot here and up here. We've got immigrants coming in at Ellis Island over here. And then they're staying in that area, saving up money until they can transport to another part of the country. If you were to use a region, what region is the least amount of foreign-born? Yep, Southeast. Which I find really interesting, because if you think about the way people are, Southerners tend to be more old school, traditional. But if you look at this, it makes sense. They're the ones that have been here the longest, that have the least amount of new people running through their territory. And if you look at the Civil War, you'll see why there was such a difference. I mean, look at this area here. Very old school, traditional. We've been here a long time, family history. We want it the way we've always had it. And then you've got all these new people coming in up here from all these different cultures. And it's just a different world in a lot of ways. I think that's very interesting. You'll also notice, by the way, that we have a red group right up here by where we're located, because a lot of immigrants settled in our territory, whether it's Brandon or Marshall, Minnesota over here, Mankato. New Ulm, Minnesota was full of Germans. They came around 1880. So we did see a lot of immigrants in our area too. Good. Now let's take a look at this. This is really interesting. This shows you our ancestry with the largest populations in our country, or in counties. Excuse me. So let me pull it down here so we can see it a little more clearly. So we're looking for patterns. So let's take a look at our colors. You'll see that like this maroon color stands for African American population. Orange stands for Aleutian or Eskimo American. American Indian in yellow, Dutch in green, English is purple, Finnish is a lighter green, and so on. German is light blue, Irish is this dark purple, Italian is this really like a periwinkle color, Mexican is pink, Norwegian is light green, Puerto Rican is a really hot pink. So let's take a look. What do you see? What similarities do you see? Okay, so number one, we've got lots of African Americans down in the South. That makes sense, right? We see more down south than we see up north. Good. What do you see the most color of? Holy cow, you are right. Look at all the German territory. Everything from here all the way to here, even some down in there, all the way across. Look at all the light blue. We had a huge German population. And that's why when I collect all your family histories in this class, I expect a lot of German blood because we see a lot of it, especially in our part of the country, especially in the Midwest. Good. What other cultures do you see? Yeah, we've got a lot of American Indian here, South Dakota because of our reservations, up here, Montana, North Dakota, Washington. Good. What else? Yep. Is there any wonder we would have a lot of Mexican heritage right here? Because it's right by the border, right? So we would see that Mexican heritage in Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California. Good. And we see that it kind of works its way up a little bit. So we see some of that up here too. Good. What else? Take a look at the East Coast. What do you see over there? Yeah, we see lots of Irish over here. And look at this. Lots of Italian in that area. So unfortunately, you know, when I want to take a sample of your backgrounds, I would love to see more of that, but we don't have as much of that over here as we do on the East Coast. And also on the West Coast, you'll see some of that over here too. And I want you to look at one thing in particular. Take a look right next to South Dakota. You'll see that there's another color. What color do you see right next to South Dakota? In Iowa? Yeah, we see green. We see Dutch right here and right here. Have any of you been to the Tulip Festival in Sioux Center? If you've ever been to Northwestern College, Orange City, Sioux Center, that entire area is just Dutch, Dutch, Dutch. And remember that when these people came, these are like my husband's ancestors, they didn't speak English, so they wanted to stay together and speak the same language. They had the same culture. They felt comfortable. So that county is very strongly Dutch, and it still is. And they're very proud of their heritage. If you go to New Ulm, Minnesota, you will see a huge population of Germans because they settled there. They settled there and spoke the same language. So as you look at new immigrants coming to the U.S., and you're like, oh, they're not speaking English. Remember, it took us about a generation for your family to even really start speaking English. It was mostly the kids, and they would help translate for the parents. That's very common in our culture, including us and what we went through too. So I thought you might find that kind of interesting. Very cool. All right, that's it for today. See you later.